right, we are joined today by Alice Kraft. Alice is a research associate at the Conference Board of Canada. And why don't we actually start with, do you want to provide an overview of what the Conference Board of Canada is? And thanks, by the way, for coming on.
No worries at all. Thank you, Stephen and Diana, for having me. So the Conference Board is one of Canada's largest and oldest applied research organizations. So what that means is we are fully independent, we are research-led, and we're providing insights into critical public policy areas that matter to Canadians and that matter to decision makers, right? So the Conference Board is largely known for our economic research and our economic forecasting capabilities. So you'll see our lovely Chief Economist Pedro speaking about a lot of issues that are key to Canada's economic health and growth. But we also have a number of teams that are looking into salient public policy areas. So an education and skills team, a health team, innovation, sustainability, and we also have an immigration team. So that's the team that I'm a part of. And the research that we're looking into is basically getting to the heart of the wicked problems that face us in the immigration space, Canadians, decision makers, and immigrants themselves, right? And how to make the system and the reality of immigration a positive outcome for Canadians and immigrants themselves. So we look into labor market outcomes, we look into the ability of certain rural and urban areas to attract and retain immigrants. We look into, potential healthcare outcomes. We look into the impact of immigration on specific sectors, for example, like residential construction, which is a super interesting report that came out of our team recently. So a real grab bag, but really getting to the heart of those wicked problems and finding those applied solutions, right? Providing those key recommendations to say what needs to happen to move forward on some of these wicked problems.
Wow, this is super interesting because I know whenever we interface with the immigration department and they are talking about immigration policy, like, for example, how did the comprehensive ranking system come about? How did Canada decide that these were the algorithms that should be applied to selecting? And they talk a lot about, well, these types of newcomers don't have good outcomes. And I've always wondered, based on what studies? And so perhaps you can say a little bit about that. What insight do you have into based on what studies? And are the results of some of these reports that the Conference Board is working on bringing about different results than what perhaps those algorithms seem to be trying to achieve?
Absolutely. I could definitely speak on that. But I will say, I am not working in the government. I can't speak to what information that they're privy to. And also there are certain, legislations and rules about what policymakers and what people work in governments are allowed to say that they're looking at and that they're passing on to, their ministers or their municipal leaders, whatever that case may be. So there are some sort of caveats to that. But I would say that I think the immigration department and, provincial immigration departments as well do a really good job of keeping their head above the water and keeping an eye on pieces of research that come out from places like the Conference Board, but from a whole host of other research organizations, from academics, from our universities, and you guys speak to a lot of those people as well, right? These economists that are producing insights into what do these outcomes look like, what do these not. And I think what also gets to the heart of what's difficult to understand this justification behind something like the comprehensive ranking system is how do you measure, right? How do you set the bar for what is a good outcome, what is a bad outcome? What data do we have that is available? What relevant data do we have that can be responsive to our current labor market, to our current population levels, our demographic levels, and how can we use that data effectively? So that is the task of not just the government, right? That's the task of
course.
all sorts of people involved in this kind of applied research.
Yeah. And I think you recently published a paper or a study that we can link to in the show notes regarding one way which I think could be used to measure the success of a program, which is immigrants or newcomers being able to find jobs, or the converse, Canadian businesses being able to hire them.
Definitely. Yeah, so we've recently just brought out a report. Thank you for sharing as well, Stephen, in the show notes. That'd be great. That is looking into immigration, like assessing the immigration for labor shortages model, but really from this granular level. And also taking into account that employers, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, that's who we were speaking to in the report and to our recommendations as well, who we're hoping to reach with those recommendations. They are critical stakeholders in the immigration system, but how often are they involved in conversations like this, or how often are we speaking to them in our research about what do good outcomes look like for you? So maybe to provide like a little bit of context, like wider context into why we wanted to look into the report. This is a super disruptive time in immigration right now. We're seeing a lot of policy change based on levels, based on numbers, raw numbers coming in and allocations, right, across these different streams. And so this is really taking up a lot of the conversation in terms of how do we design a system that selects the right number and the right individuals who make up those numbers. But actually, that's one half of a much broader system. And the other half is what happens to immigrants when they get here, right? This is the outcomes piece. And the successful integration of immigrants into the labor market is a really critical, like, part of that other half, right? That's a really key piece. And at the moment, I think we're failing to address this like crucial issue because our rhetoric is largely being taken up, or the space is largely being taken up by these numbers conversations. And what is the cost of sort of neglecting this labor market integration piece? Well, the Bank of Canada a few weeks ago comes out with a newcomer unemployment rate, apologies, of 11.6%, right? That's pretty significant. And I would argue potentially an unacceptably high level for our newcomers, for our immigrants.
And much higher than the national average.
Yeah, I think the national average, I mean, I think the conference board put the national average for October at 6.6%. So yeah, that's a significant number.
When they say newcomers, are they referring to new permanent residents or international students and foreign workers as well?
I can't speak to the methodology of the Bank of Canada report. Usually when like StatsCan and Bank of Canada refer to newcomers, we're looking at new permanent residents, but I would have to fact check on that. I'm not 100% sure on their definitions. They do also in that report break down two different levels. I think they do speak about international students and different demographic groups within then those subcategories. So it'd definitely be good to check out. But yeah, that's our broader context, right, and why we want to address this issue. And then, as I mentioned, this stakeholder collaboration and stakeholder ownership. And by ownership, I mean like recognizing the role that all these different stakeholders are playing within this wider ecosystem around the labor market integration. And this is where our employers are sitting, right? So a group that we have like founded, a little research center at the conference board on the immigration team, the Center for Business Insights on Immigration. We're looking to bring employers to the table and create that engagement, right? From research, but research into like active policy, like active change. So yeah, we've approached this issue from the vantage point of SMEs. What do SMEs need? how are they understanding and interactive with the immigration system. So yeah, there's a little bit of a context background for you. I don't know if we're ready to dive into potentially some of the findings, or if you have any sort of further questions on that context piece.
Mm. I have one. I mean, I think that what you're saying has a lot of, it resonates in a lot of different ways, a lot of the different things that you've said. I like the comment, these are disruptive times, and I think that that's definitely true. One thing that we've been talking about a little on the show is what the impacts of changes are going to have on Canada's brand, so to speak, in the international context. And so, you know, one thing, and maybe it's now, maybe it's later during our discussion, is just to get contextually an understanding of what are the biggest barriers to having this information showcased. Because as you say, the public discourse is kind of going in one direction, I feel like, almost in spite of certain types of reports and evidence. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that we should definitely get into further in our discussion. And the branding piece is really interesting, right? And I think that exists like up here, like on the very high level of our numbers, our levels, and how this nebulous concept of, you know, a really well-running, well-founded immigration system based on like our public trust. That there's so many different needles to thread when we're going into this very high level of what does success look like. But I think what this report does really well is demonstrates the need for hyper local success stories, because that's where immigration is really happening, right? People arriving to communities, getting jobs. That's, and in large part, like their first interaction really with like joining and adapting to Canadian society, and making that a positive experience for employer and immigrant, and being able to mobilize and share those hyperlocal success stories, I think plays a really important role.
I like that focus on hyperlocal. Like both Deanna and my respective law firms
Mhm.
interact daily with Canadian businesses that have identified talent either abroad or foreign work nationals who are inside Canada who they are struggling to hire, or foreign nationals who are inside Canada trying to change employers and are struggling with employers who are reluctant to hire foreign workers. And
Yeah.
so we're dealing with that at the micro level daily. And then you
Mhm.
can see at the macro level, you know, TikTok videos of, say, 100 people lined up outside of a big box retailer, with people then, you know, the discourse changing to, well, how can there be a labor shortage if there's 100 people lining up outside a big box retailer, and the federal government imposing universal changes to hit a 5.1% foreign worker ratio rate, or yeah, foreign national ratio rate, that then does not meet the need of Canadian
Mhm.
businesses that actually have identified people who they want to hire.
Yeah. And just to add one piece to that is also we're daily interacting with people that when you try and come up with an immigration strategy for them and you come out empty-handed, and it's just, you can be quite gobsmacked as a practitioner that this isn't the person that Canada wants. Like, really? This double degree holding Canadian, like, genius, or sorry, a double Canadian degree holding person who's clearly going in all the right directions and has been here for this length of time. We don't want this person, but we are going to select that one. Like, it can be very, you know, I understand how algorithms are designed, but it can be very disorienting as a practitioner to see the real life effect of who is a yes and who is a no right now based on the systems.
Yeah, and I definitely have so much respect for the work that you guys are doing, and you know, lawyers and practitioners, frontline service providers across Canada, right? It's, you provide an incredible service, and yeah, you're facing those realities every day with your clients. It's
Well, I have to
it's
say
a
that's
challenge.
mutual, because when we try and say this system is not working, they will say, well, but your experience is anecdotal. And we'll say,
Mm.
but the conference board's research is not anecdotal. This is very well considered, sophisticated research. So we work hand and foot, and that's why it's really great to have you on to kind of walk us through some of those findings.
Yeah.
No,
Let's dive into key
absolutely.
finding one because it kind of ties into what we were just talking about. And so key finding one was in fast-growing small and mid-sized Canadian cities, small and medium-sized enterprises in multiple sectors identified skill shortages as their most common employment challenge. And I was just saying, like, we noticed that at our firms. How do you respond, or how do you reconcile that with the TikTok videos that show these huge lines that do seem to be at least dominating the online discourse of how can there be a labor shortage and a skill shortage if there are long lineups outside some employers?
This is a great question. And again, I think it speaks to the importance for conducting research like this, like actually getting information from firsthand, um, and like presenting it, right? As you said, Diana, like we do need these key like research driven insights into what is happening in the labor market, what is happening at these local levels. So yeah, what this research looked into was five of the fastest growing small and mid-sized cities in Canada. So I think that's like good to sort of establish who we're talking about, where we're talking about. And the reason we wanted to look into these small and mid-sized cities is because we are seeing a trend um, away from newcomers, new immigrants settling in Canada's big three, right? Our big urban centers, so Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto. That in the I think it was the 80s, 90s, the number of newcomers settling in these three cities is close to 80%. Now that is more like 53%. So where are like immigrants, where are newcomers settling? And we're increasingly seeing that that's outside of these major urban centers in these smaller and mid-sized cities. So that's a really, really interesting point. And then two, we know that there are potential challenges for these smaller mid-sized cities to adapt to this population growth and demographic change, as well as attracting and retaining newcomers. So we particularly looked at five cities that had the highest percentage increase of in their immigrant population between 2016 and 2021. So these are our last two census years. So that was Abbotsford Mission in BC, Saskatoon, Oshawa, Moncton, and Halifax. So also cities that I think gather a lot of attention based on their population growth and their demographic change. And so what we heard, we spoke to small and medium-sized business owners. We spoke to what we call SME serving organizations. So these are our chambers of commerce, our boards of trade, our workforce development organizations, people that are working with employers daily, particularly small and medium-sized employers. And we also spoke to government policymakers and immigrant settlement service providers, particularly those who are providing employment services. So across the board, right, across these five cities, the organizations that are working with employers are continually saying that labor supply is the key employment challenge for our employers. So one SME serving organization in Saskatoon told us that the single largest factor limiting companies' growth is the labor supply. And what I found really interesting in Halifax, Moncton, and Saskatoon, so these are three cities that are their urban centers, right? They're not like Oshawa is relatively close to Toronto, Abbotsford Mission close to Vancouver. These three sort of standalone cities noted that their labor shortage prior to the pandemic was limited to certain sectors, certain occupations. So potentially like pointing us towards a structural labor shortage or a structural skill shortage for these certain sectors, occupations. But now that has grown to cross sectors, cross skills. But then when we dug in a little bit further with our SME owners and operators, so our small and medium-sized businesses, those are businesses hiring 499 employees or below. And that can include micro, I think what's referred to as micro businesses, so with like 10 employees or below, is that they weren't reporting a shortage of applicants applying for available positions, but rather a shortage of specific skills among these applicants. So again, researchers, you want to dig in a little bit further. What are these skills? So we found that these SMEs were looking for technical skills. And as I mentioned, we do know that there are structural skill shortages in Canada, and this was definitely reflected in our findings from this report. So SMEs in the manufacturing, the construction, and the repairs and maintenance industries in particular were reporting these persistent gaps in the technical skills, technical knowledge. But we also found that across the board, across the industries that we spoke to, these SMEs, these business owners and operators, were also looking for social and emotional skills. So this is otherwise known as soft skills or human skills. And what does that look like? That looks like traits like trustworthiness, reliability, and a prior awareness of workplace norms and culture. So really, what I find really interesting about that is this is the same for anyone walking through the door, looking for SMEs looking to fill positions. But we can already see why there would potentially be some barriers within these small and medium-sized employers for wanting to either consider, invest in, approach immigration, like broadly immigration, to fill these shortages.
Wow,
So
this
that
is
soft
super
skill
interesting.
shortage,
Yeah.
like sounds like what you read in the news say about people preferring Canadian experience. Um, and also, I mean, it sounds a bit like preferring Canadian cultural personalities maybe, or office workplace norms. Is that sort of what you're saying?
I wouldn't like what I actually found really interesting in this research is Canadian experience did not come up in any of my conversations
Mm.
or our conversations. And I found that really interesting because that's like a marked difference from if this study was like happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I feel like that Canadian experience phrase could potentially have been used a lot more frequently. So we didn't hear particularly about Canadian experience. And potentially it's because we were really encouraging participants in this research to identify those specific skills in terms of what they were looking for. And as I mentioned, this is the same for immigrant candidates and non-immigrant candidates. So that's, I
I
think
have a
that's
lot to say on this topic. And
interesting.
I have to say, I mean, to me, the thing about soft skills, I the way that I define it in my own mind is about EQ. Like, do you have emotional intelligence? You know, can you make good judgment calls? Can you read people? Can you enter a meeting room and interact in an effective way with other people? Like, it's quite a nebulous concept in some ways because there's a lot that's packed into this idea. But I think that sometimes you said something, Alice. I can't remember exactly what language you used, but it was very evocative, but it's like it ends up becoming quite close to what are the cultural values. And so I think sometimes it's not about Canadian experience, is like, is this person's way of approaching this situation the same as mine? So it might not now being described as Canadian experience, but I think that it's about whether or not there's a sense that this person shares my values, shares my culture. I think that for me, just being super blunt, there are ways that racism creep into hiring practices, and to me, soft skills is a place that occurs.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, and we'll talk about this potentially when we discuss some different findings, is if this is a required skill that you're asking for at the hiring stage, how are you assessing for that in your like applicant interviews, and how are you understanding the skills that are required for the role versus the skills that are nice to have, the skills that can be developed on the job.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is also a key part of that dynamic, thinking
Yeah,
about the technical skills versus the social and emotional skills.
that's true. And I'm really not trying to be inflammatory, even though I'm using very inflammatory words. I mean, I'm saying this from the perspective that like they're like, if you want to see what somebody's actual physical capabilities are, you can give them a test. But when it comes to assessing their soft skills, there's no bright line test. You can't just figure out what their judgment is going to be like when they're facing a complex situation with a client. Are they going to deal with it in a way that's going to resonate for you and for your firm or your company or whatever that might be? But I think that there is a knee-jerk tendency to be like, same feels safer. And that's what I
Mhm.
mean. Like, I mean, to use the word racism, I understand it's offensive, it's inflammatory, but I think that a lot of hiring decisions can perhaps be fear-based hiring decisions because people just aren't equipped to make meaningful, nuanced assessments with respect to these soft skills.
Yeah, and I think that really nicely leads on to another key takeaway that we had from this report. And that was, while that we heard from our SMEs that they are using these practical and inclusive strategies at the hiring stage to evaluate newcomers' education, experience, and skills, there's a lack of an intentionality to adapt potential like
Mm,
recruitment outreach, um, and also at the like hiring stage and then beyond that on the onboarding stage. So what does it look like to hire, recruit, and retain immigrant talent? So we did hear that there was some real movement among our SMEs to use things like working trials. Show me the skills that you have. How would you conduct this this phone call, or like this is what I would expect an individual to do on this job, and that's what's making up part of the recruitment process. Um, so that's what we would refer to as inclusive hiring strategies. But sometimes we found that that is just in action as opposed to intention. It's not, this isn't a way to make this hiring inclusive. That's just the way that potentially these business owners and operators have always done things. And again, you
mm,
think about those positions that are heavy in technical skills. If you say that you can use this machinery, I'm going to double check that, right? And see what that looks like. Um, so that I think is a really positive move, and that's what makes like that has been shown, these like inclusive hiring strategies, to make a difference in terms of immigrants being able to show their skills as opposed to like say use the regular sort of like CV method. But one barrier that we identified in terms of SMEs engaging in immigration or engaging with local international talent to meet their skill and labor shortages is that there's a lack of an effort to intentionally outreach to immigrants and newcomers in their communities. So we found that they are like our SMEs are rarely adapting their strategies to potentially the current realities of their small and mid-sized cities. So again, we're looking at those areas that have experienced a lot of growth in their immigrant populations. So are you reaching out to immigrant serving agencies or immigrant serving organizations, those who are already set up to one, assess immigrant skills prior to entering the labour market. And two, oftentimes these immigrant serving agencies are actually able to provide post-hire support. So working with employers and saying, how is it going? Is there a potential communication or cultural mismatch that could easily be mediated and discussed just potentially with a little bit more support from, again, these agencies that have a lot of knowledge about what that looks like, about their service users being immigrants who are looking to enter into the labor market.
It's also too like that rather than it being a perspective of trying to create an adaptive environment where that person can be adapted into the Canadian workplace, wondering whether, like, just being curious as to whether the difference is something that can help elevate the Canadian workplace to the next level. So if we're trying to do this in an innovative, like, to try and to try and actually benefit the Canadian work environment, not starting from the assumption that the Canadian way is the best possible way, but that perhaps we're going to diversify our understanding, and that this will enable us to actually gain insights by incorporating other approaches, other views. And I think that, but I agree with you entirely that it's about figuring out ways to effectively onboard and recruit. And I think that that's a very I don't think that we're we fully learn that. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of understanding how to do that effectively.
I think one of the other challenges that a lot of companies have when recruiting is they'll post an advertisement and they will be bombarded by applications, often from overseas recruiting agencies that are trying to help people immigrate, or foreign nationals who are inside Canada who may need a labor market impact assessment or something like that. And then the recent permanent residents who can work right away get lost in the shuffle, often because it's hard to distinguish in a resume and application whether someone who just moved to Canada is a foreign national who will be hired or complicated to get a work permit for or a permanent resident.
But also just look at the entire scheme of the labor market impact assessment. What it is there a Canadian who on paper, completely on paper, can do this job? It completely carves out any assessment of those soft skills, which everyone knows, as per this discussion, are critical to success in the workplace. And if so, then you cannot bring on somebody who might elevate the entire workforce and workplace for the entire Canadian workforce. And so it's sort of like it's starting with a backward proposition, in my view.
Well, let's jump to key finding 4, which is negative experiences and limited understanding of immigration processes discourage small or medium-sized enterprises from engaging with the immigration system. So Deanna and I could both rant for hours about how the temporary foreign worker program, and to a lesser extent the international mobility program, can dissuade small to medium-sized enterprises or large enterprises.
They're specifically designed for that purpose.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear what these companies told you, like some of why they don't like these programs.
Yeah, you know what? This is something that I think people looking into this area, as you said, could potentially wax lyrical about, right? This could be a very, very, very long conversation. But what I found really interesting as an outcome of this research is that while there were negative experiences reported of engagement with a wide variety of immigration programs, these experiences of individual employers leads to a much wider problem, a much wider ripple effect of negative perceptions of immigration more broadly. So when we were speaking to employers, we did not make the like we didn't recruit to say you've used this specific program or you've engaged with this specific immigration policy or stream. We were very much interested in finding out general attitudes, experiences, and knowledge, honestly, like of immigration. And we got a really wide range of experiences and knowledge. To on one end, like what is immigration, what counts as an immigrant, which I found really interesting. And on the other end, we had employers who were very engaged, very clued up, but had gained that knowledge at potentially their own expense. So working with a lawyer or a consultant to try and understand immigration programs to meet their labor and skill needs. So yeah, we did speak with employers who had a knowledge and understanding of temporary foreign worker programs. We spoke with employers who had potentially supported their immigrant employees through visa transition, formally or informally. And then we also spoke with employers who had hired like permanent residents who already were in Canada and who were coming from abroad. So a pretty wide range, which was super interesting. And pretty much across the board, we got complaints. So with our temporary foreign worker program, especially these small and medium-sized businesses found the cost was a big barrier to participation. And they also found that because of the length of time included in some of these processes, they found it unsuitable for meeting these short-term labor market needs, which is, the stated design or the stated objective of that program. We also found that with these like permanent programs and supporting immigrants through this transition or employees through this transition, it was stressful. The length of time and the inability to sort of get information, like reciprocal information through the process, made it very uncertain. And there was reports of a lot of red tape, right? And a lot of bureaucracy and things like this. But these are experiences, again, they're anecdotal, and I do think that this kind of like quantitative evidence is really important when we're talking to policymakers, because sometimes it isn't about the numbers, it's about what is the experience, again, that hyperlocal experience of people using these programs. But again, to go back to this sort of wider ripple effect, what we found in these small and mid-sized cities particularly is that our employers get a lot of support, knowledge and resource from other employers. So we call these like SME to SME networks. And so, yeah, if employer X has had a difficult experience, the chances are that there's a whole other group of employers who have then heard about that experience, and then they form their own sort of perceptions around the immigration system more broadly. So this is where we go back to these hyper local success stories, and they do exist, right? We know that there are positive impacts of having immigrant talent integrated into our workforce. And we can go on to talk about that a little bit later, like why would SMEs want to engage in immigration or their local international talent? But using these SME to SME knowledge and information sharing networks to say, you know what, I'm signposting, this is someone who had a great experience, this is exactly what they did, and gets to literally the fine points of, this is the number that I called, these are the people that I spoke to, this is the piece of paper that I needed to sign and do this. Like, that information is so valuable. And if we're not getting that to SMEs, then we're potentially losing a trick there, right? We're wanting to use these information sharing networks to share these hyperlocal success stories.
I love your optimism here, and I need to avoid being hyperbolic, but I think that which will be challenging because it is in my nature, but I do feel that the system is truly designed to prevent that kind of knowledge sharing. The rate at which things are changing means that one kernel of good information will no longer become a kernel of information. That phone number that was useful will be canceled by the time that the next person can be passed that piece of information. And so I think it's more for me, and I think for Steve as well, what we've been talking about so much is the kind of theater of the absurd nature of how the program is being run, and asking a lot of why questions around why that is the case. But I still think that this focus on the hyper local, I was saying to a bunch of our immigration colleagues last night that sharing the almost hilarity of experiences around how people are interfacing with the system now, like how true, genuine situations that all of us can agree should have led to a happy outcome, and the sort of tortured and convoluted process that somebody needed to go through in order to achieve that, in spite of being represented by incredibly competent counsel and teams of people with thousands of dollars. So I think that that's the kind of information sharing that we would also like to evoke, to show that it's just truly a broken system at this moment. And that I'm trying to kind of ask people to share in some kind of an organized way too. But I really appreciate your sentiment. I think hyperlocal is truly the right way of doing it right now, because if you're saying that this information is anecdotal, then I feel like we're all lost.
I mean, it's I don't even know. Like I mean, hyperlocal anecdotal success stories are definitely valuable.
100%.
I think it's really hard for those hyperlocal success stories to break through the chorus of negative employer interactions with the program. One of the things I've been going on about on the podcast are also the way stats are sort of tracked and manipulated by the government.
For
And
sure.
I've pulled up the administrative burden baseline count that the government has, and they track in all the different laws that Canada has what burdens are imposed on businesses. And so they have their stats for the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations and the Act on what burdens are imposed. And somehow they calculate that in June 30, 2014, the administrative burden was 14. By the end of the Conservative government in June 30, 2015, although the election was in October, the count rose to 59. And I've complained about this on Twitter. Officially, from June 30, 2015 to June 30, 2023, there was only one new burden added to employers in Canadian immigration regulations, and that has remained unchanged from July 1, 2023 to June 30, 2024. And this kind of ties into what Deanna has been talking about with the erosion of public accountability in the way by changing from regulations to public policies and everything. Because I can see from Deanna's face and Alice's face, like, really not one new burden was imposed on businesses through all the changes in processing fees that companies can help with, through the explosion in processing times that Alice mentioned. A labor market impact assessment right now is taking, I mean, officially the stat is 100 business days for a company that wants to hire a foreign worker and support their permanent resident. That's, that's the type of things that, like, the anecdotal story has to break through 1 month recruitment and then 100 business days for a Canadian
And then maybe a
business,
work permit
and then
application,
maybe a work permit application.
which might get refused, and then you need to go for judicial review, and we're
Yeah,
talking
but none of
years.
that shows up in the way the government tracks whether they're
Yeah.
imposing burdens on Canadian businesses.
Right. Right.
But I think what is I'm going to be the voice of optimism.
Yes, please.
I'm
Yes, please.
I'm deciding that that's my role
Yes, please.
in our conversation.
It's welcome very much.
One side of the experience is literally going through the process, and whether that is going through the LMIA determination process, whether that is hiring from abroad, whatever that may be, there is a huge amount of international talent, so people born outside of Canada who are in Canada who are underemployed. And a recent report by TRIEC, so Toronto, like umbrella settlement service organization and research organization, estimated that the cost of that underemployment is $30 billion.
Wow.
So you look at these processes and continuing to look outside of Canada's borders, actually, what will be a great place to make some improvements in the perceptions and the experiences of SMEs with immigration more broadly is with the international talent that exists already in their communities. And, you know, as I mentioned, because we're looking into the communities that have experienced a significant increase in their immigrant population, like this is where these changes in attitudes, experience, and tensions can be borne out. And this is sort of why we were looking into these areas. And then getting to the point of what does an SME's experience with immigration look like? It's whoever is going to be walking in their door, right? Whether they're coming with an unfilled application, a renewal of another like status, whatever process that they're in, it's that human to human connection. What does that look like in terms of that interaction? And what really motivates this work and some of the other sort of like labor market work that happens in the immigration team at the conference board is expediting that immigrant labor market integration and addressing that underemployment piece to the benefit of immigrants, Canadians, and those employers who should be able to have confidence in assessing the experiences, the skills, the qualifications of international talent to make that immigration for labor market and labor skills model work.
I love this so much. Honestly,
yeah.
I think that this is it. I mean, and this does take us full circle to where we started when I bombarded you with my like triple barrel question within 3 seconds of starting, which is like the Canadian immigration ban and brand and the sort of shifting attitude towards immigration, and how do we regather ourselves around this? And you know, this is something that is being reported quite a lot. Like, when did Canada start this shift? What precipitated it? This kind of witch hunt against foreign workers and, you know, international students that we once were, you know, actively and you know, vociferously recruiting from abroad. When did we start saying you are the reason for all the problems? And you know, let's just like, you know, stay calm, calm down.
I mean, the demand is huge, right? 100-day processing also just implies that like the private sector really does want to hire international talent.
Yeah.
Now, some I imagine, especially after our most recent episode with Mike Moffat, may say, well, they want to hire that international talent because they're cheaper than Canadians. Did that come up at all? Wage suppression? Like, did any company say, no, that's what we're aiming for?
I would struggle to see the conversation where someone says that, like an employer reports that to a researcher like me. What we heard from our employers was this skill and labor shortage, right? That's what we heard. We also spoke to them about like potential changes that they made to their hiring, potentially their like benefits packages, their like what they've been doing to try and attract, right? They're trying to fill their labor and skill shortages. That's what they're trying to do. But what I think is really interesting consideration, and particularly for like practitioners like yourself, is this is one of a number of problems. This is one of a number of things that are, you know, challenges for their day-to-day business. So how do we make it as easy as possible to engage with the immigration program or with international and local talent? And I was really struck by in this research the diversity of experience and the diversity of like knowledge and awareness. of what is an immigrant. Do I already hire immigrants? I don't know, right? That was like something that we definitely heard.
Did any
Um,
of them talk about the employer compliance regime within the temporary foreign worker program?
I didn't speak about the employer compliance regime. No, I heard about engagement with the like perceptions of the temporary foreign worker program. So people kind of turned off of it. Like I've heard that it's not suitable for this. But
There's a
no,
lot
not
of
specifically
liability.
about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Not
I mean, that
specifically
may
about
like they
that
may
portion
not
of the
have used the
process.
words employer compliance, but like when
Mhm.
I do a fair amount of employer compliance work, and it can range from like, I've had companies come to me that were fined because they hired an admin assistant, and the admin assistant wanted to get some training in being a mechanic. And so the company said, yeah, sure, we'll do a few hours a week where you can like gain some mechanic skills. And the government said, you hired an admin assistant. Mechanic is a different national occupation classification. You are fined. And that company, I could see a company saying, forget it. Like this is too rigid. It's not reflective of business
Yeah.
practices. So I'm
Yeah,
just
and I'm
maybe
just
like,
trying to be a good employer and I'm trying
yeah,
to make for
like
a happy employee. And how can that be something that makes me like the liability that companies expose themselves to by bringing on foreign workers is unacceptable. And not to say that people should not be fined for things that are true grievances that are reported, but I think that this is also like this takes me back to my theater of the absurd, but I'm not going to do another rant just yet.
I guess like in the interest, so looking at the time, if you had to give like recommendations, I know you have recommendations in the paper to say all three groups, the immigrants looking for work, the companies looking to hire, and the government, what would your recommendations be?
Yeah, so with this report, we were specifically looking to address some recommendations at the employer level and then at the SME organization, serving organization level. So those chambers, those boards of trade. But what we found is a key recommendation is at the local level, investing in and creating knowledge and resource sharing networks. And as we've noted, employers have a lot on their plate, particularly our small and medium-sized employers.
Mm,
The capacity and the resources that they have are like potentially stretched very thin, especially with these micro employers. So what can our SME serving organizations do to act as a source of support or a signpost to essential services? And Diana, like to speak to your earlier point of the like constant changing in processes and people, it shouldn't be down to our employers to have to navigate all of these changes, but being able to step out of, their lane, make those connections and invest in local connections and networks with their chambers and their boards, with immigrant serving organizations.
mhm,
Creating that connective
for
tissue
sure.
between these people who are working at the local level is a key recommendation. I think that can make a really big difference to SMEs considering and engaging with immigration for labor and skill shortages.
Yes, on this recruitment and integration piece, especially, there's absolutely no doubt. Like there's a brain trust that needs to be really fostered, and I think I love the idea that this is what you're trying to encourage, the like proliferation of these insights that are now growing out of good practices.
Definitely. And something that I think potentially speaks to our policymakers at the federal level and all the way down, um, is another finding from this report is that none of these issues are existing in isolation. So both our SMEs and our immigrants are struggling to make this connection through overstretched public infrastructure. And this can be a really, like, this is a salient point. This demand, like, has taken up a lot of the conversation, like, more broadly as well. But these are cities that are undergoing intense development. Public transit is potentially being overstretched to new areas of development. And there is, a period of like time where these key infrastructures need to be developed to meet the new flow of supply and demand from like service users. And the same thing with affordable and accessible housing and also affordable and accessible childcare. And what we find is that immigrants, particularly newcomers, are acutely affected by these like overstretched public infrastructures. Immigrants arrive with little knowledge of public transit, rental housing markets, knowledge about the childcare availabilities in their local communities, and
As
due
they
to
exist.
as and where they exist, and also due to like limited Canadian credit history, there also is further barriers to accessing like things like car lease agreements and entering into rental agreements. So an ask that we had for employers is to potentially look to adapt their workplace policies as and where they can to, again, create a win-win, meeting
For
those
sure.
labor and skill shortages and working towards integrating newcomers and international talent into their labor market. But again, are we asking employers too much? Where can they be like working with, again, these organizations at the local level to
Totally.
advocate for these changes?
Yeah.
Businesses, the
Yeah.
business community, they're massively important,
Yeah.
right? In determining where we go as a country, where we're moving forward,
For
and what
sure.
our federal, municipal, provincial policymakers are listening to. So advocating for these sorts of changes is really important.
Totally. If they have to invent those systems, then yes, that's too much to ask. But if they are going to be able to tap into a network that's already being created and that is being openly shared, then no, it's bare minimum. It, like
Or
Mike Moffat
notifying that
said,
this is a need, right? This is a
yeah,
need.
yeah.
This is a barrier that I have to meeting my labor and skill shortages, which is what all of this is about. Communicating that need hopefully can spur some action as well.
Yeah, like Mike
Yeah.
Moffat said, these are basic human rights, housing, childcare, he was speaking about housing in particular, but if you can't meet those needs for your human resources team, then you know you can't access that workforce properly. And so
Yeah.
I think that was really well put by him.
And I'll give it a specific example. Like when we're talking about, businesses, I know you mentioned like different working hours. One of the issues that has emerged in the temporary foreign worker program and the international mobility program is remote work and whether or not it's allowed to hire foreign workers in remote positions. And last week or 2 weeks ago, the intracompany transfer program rules were amended to state business operations with no physical commercial premises, i.e. operating from non-commercial location or businesses that are in a co-shared premise are not eligible to transfer ICTs to Canada. So there's almost this just, if you work out of a WeWork, not allowed ICTs, I'm sure there'll be spillover effects in the foreign worker program. And it just seems like the government is almost running counter to what you're saying in terms of helping businesses accommodate a diverse range of needs.
It's sort of like in like ignoring the reality of how businesses are evolving. And so we're acting at cross purposes with, and I mean, not all businesses, for some, that is a very important component, but for others, success means a very lean practice, which means remote work. And so there's no one size fits all. And I think being able to have a nuanced and sophisticated system, yes, I understand it's more complicated, but more
Yeah.
complicated
But I mean,
doesn't
even just to
necessarily.
change like that, like we've had people contacting us saying, hey, we've got workers who are here as ICTs. we were previously allowed our WeWork shared work premise.
For
Are
sure.
we going to be able to extend these work permits?
Yeah,
We
well,
have to
same
get a
with
new, and I
people that were
mean,
with binational, like companies that have two companies in two countries, not three countries. Can we
oh,
extend
that's,
their
yeah.
work permit extension is in process? Can we keep them? Don't know. So, so yeah, there are lots of these examples, but yeah.
So what is the
Yeah, and I
process
do
like
think
of,
like
yeah, sorry, go on.
these changes, like they are coming thick and fast, and I'm definitely not the person to decide whether one is beneficial, one is not beneficial. But what we do know is that adjustments are taking place in reaction to the realities, right? That we've found. We're seeing the backlog on the infrastructure side. We're seeing,
Sorry,
you
when you
know,
say you're seeing the backlog on the infrastructure side, what do you mean?
so these overstretching of these public key public infrastructures that like um are needed to work and are needed to make like small and medium-sized cities work. Our public transit, our
Mm,
affordable housing and
Housing.
accommodation, right? All of this is feeding into some of the changes that we're seeing come about. But what is important is this level setting and expectation setting to ameliorate the divide between the two realities of, you know, setting up Canadians for Success, providing these or meeting these labor and skill shortages in the most sustainable way. Um, yeah, so potentially that does not answer what do I do if I don't know if my permits can be renewed. Um, but I think it's a difficult time. It's a very difficult time. And creating some more consensus and some more like paying more attention to these like hyper local stories is super
Mhm.
important.
I think perhaps we're all united in saying that these kind of knee-jerk responses, um, while we can understand where they're coming from, that they're a reaction to these pressures on social services, that they're not that they are not perhaps, well, they're not looking at the overall long-term consequences, or that they're missing so much. And I don't even think that the department is saying that that is not the case. They're just like, this is the problem. We need to kind of cut the head off of the hydra and then deal with the consequences later. And I think that what I think needs to be elevated in the conversation is what impact does that have on the Canadian brand overall in a long-term way, and what impact will that have on businesses in the short, medium, and long term? And I think that it has the potential to be extremely dramatic. And so, yeah.
I guess, oh, I think we lost Deanna or,
No, I'm
oh,
still here.
sorry. I guess my final question would just be if somebody wanted to learn more about like the Conference Board of Canada's research, where should they go? And also, I think you guys have a pretty like big immigration conference every year. Um, what like what would be is that like what kind of goes on at that conference? Because I think it's in November. So if you want to just maybe plug that for people, kind of what goes on at the Conference Board of Canada's immigration conference.
Absolutely. I'm happy to plug away given the opportunity. So yeah, November 20th and 21st this year, the Canadian Immigration Summit is happening in Ottawa. Um, we have been doing this for a number of years now. Obviously, we had a few years online for COVID, but back in person as of last year and this year. And what we like to do is get together a wide variety of stakeholders and decision makers from across these groups, right? So we're looking at policymakers, we're looking at business and industry leads, professional associations, our lovely, lovely lawyers, Canadian immigration lawyers, and settlement service providers, as well as, in large parts, immigrants themselves. And we're trying to use the expertise of people in the room to collaborate and make practical changes to how we can approach these wicked problems in immigration. So that's changes through key insights. Is there like research that is coming out that we need to know about and highlight? Obviously, that's a lot of what the conference board does, produces these insights. But we also encourage practitioners to share their best practices and to share their lessons learned. So the aim of the summit is bringing together, leaders across this field. But what we want people to leave with is, this is a new connection I've made to someone that can advance or change my practice. This is something that I've learned, can take away with what I'm working on in my part of the immigration system. So yeah, I'm super excited to attend the Canadian Immigration Summit. All the information about that summit is on the Conference Board of Canada website, along with a huge amount of research. All of the research coming out of the immigration team is freely available to access. You just need to create an account and log in. So yeah, there's a lot to dive into. And I would also encourage yourselves and people who are listening to just stay up to date with keep checking on that website and our outputs, because we do always have interesting research coming out, particularly in the immigration space, some of which will be previewed at the Immigration Summit.
Excellent. This
All
was
right.
very enlightening, Alice. Thank you so much for joining us. Very fascinating.
Not at all. I'm really, really grateful to be here. And particularly when last week you had former minister, 7-time doctorate Jason Kenney, followed up by Alice from the conference board. I really appreciate you making the time.
No, it was a really, really interesting conversation, and helped me digest some of the information from the previous podcasts of recent weeks. So I appreciate that very much.